Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video, I'll be doing a review for the latest season of Big Brother, BB22, also known as Big Brother All-Stars, and this season was a disappointment. I mean, I do personally probably enjoy this season more than most other people who just seem to hate every aspect of it, and people were complaining already from like week 1 or week 2 at how disappointing the season was, but to be honest, I enjoyed the season, I would say up until the halfway point. But there was definitely a turning point in the season to where now I'm coming out of this pretty low on the season as a whole, despite there being some high highs at some points within the season. Now, I know a lot of people try to blame the cast for the reason that this season turned out the way it was. And I will stand by this, that I still think the cast was pretty solid. I will still say that outside of a couple picks, probably like a Christmas and maybe a David, I do feel like this cast was of the caliber that I was expecting a newer all-star season to be. And I will also say that I don't really fault production that much for what went wrong with the season either. I feel like there are many other seasons that production just handled really terribly, but with this season, I do feel like production did the best they could, with a pretty major exception that we'll talk about later. But like every other thing that they did throughout this season, I feel like was done relatively well. I mean, the twists were pretty well done. The cast was, again, like a good mix of like old school and new school. Like I do feel like production didn't really do much bad here. I just feel like we got really unlucky. Unlucky that the same alliance won competition after competition. Unlucky that Tyler tried to quit the game that pretty much put all the momentum the season had to a halt. And we got unlucky that some of these players recognized the flaw in the game structure and were able to use that to dominate the game. I mean, essentially, I do think this season shows more so than any season we've seen so far how broken the game of Big Brother can be. We've gotten to the point now where competitions, I mean, this has always been the case with Big Brother, especially more so than Survivor, where competitions are much more powerful in the game of Big Brother. But I feel like we've gotten to the point now where competitions are almost everything in Big Brother. Something that I feel like the players recognize within this season is if you can get together all of the people that are more likely to win competitions, put them into one alliance, you could pretty much dominate the entire season that way. So I do think this has really exposed a massive flaw in the meta of Big Brother, to where I do think the structure of these competitions should be modified going down the line, but who knows if they'll really do it. But again, with this season though, I did still have fun seeing returning players back. I mean, I've always been a big proponent of all-star seasons. Even the ones that people consider bad, I still get some enjoyment out of them just from seeing these players we've seen before. And for me, there were definitely points within the season that had some interesting gameplay. Now, did that last the entire season? Not necessarily, but there were definitely still some points in the season that I did have a lot of fun with. But like my other Big Brother reviews, let's go through the season week by week. So let's start off with the live move-in premiere, and this was so weird. I did like how we got an intro reminiscent of the older seasons with like the narrator talking about the house, but I didn't love how the players entered the house. I mean, coming into this season, I was really hoping we were going to get a BBUK or BBOTT-esque move-in where players enter one by one, they get their interaction with Julie at the beginning, and we really get introduced to these characters once again. But instead, they entered 4 at a time, and they were instantly told to do a competition that I found really boring. I mean, just watching them do a table maze with no real narration or anything, it's just really dull. And it was also kind of hard to follow, especially because there were 4 different people doing it. And also, for some reason, they gave the 2 women groups like the harder table maze. It's like, why was that a thing also? And I should also mention that Julie Chen this season was just really awkward. I mean, we saw the first bit of this from her banter outside the house, but this season really cemented it for me that she's easily the worst host for any major reality show that I've watched. I mean, she's just so bad. I mean, all of her interactions with the players are just so awkward. And it's like literally every single live episode from this point forward, we get some sort of awkward moment from her. We get these weird quotes that she ends the episodes with. It really makes you wonder how she's been the host of this show for this long. But after the first round of the HOH comp, the players finally get to meet. And I really hated how they did this as well. I mean, where, again, it would have been so cool to see these players react to people coming in one at a time. But instead, again, we just got the groups of 4 coming in one at a time. And through that, we just missed so many of the initial reactions and interactions here, which to me was one of the things I was looking forward to the most from this live move-in. We did then get the HOH comp where Cody wins, and this is kind of unfair, especially for Memphis, who went first, as Cody was able to see some of the pedestals wobbling and anything, but really, come on, Cody was going to win anyway. And the premiere ends with the have-nots having to see their room for the first time, only for the door to be stuck. And this was just hilarious. Again, another really terrible moment for Julie Chen, where she doesn't know what's going on, and she's trying to talk to production, everything. It's really funny. And really, this premiere episode was just a complete mess, but I still had a lot of fun watching it due to the appearance of these returning players. But now for the rest of the week, where it did seem like so many of the players were playing too passively. But really, Cody takes the reins right off the bat, obviously being the first HOH. He does build numerous alliances with people like Tyler, Enzo, Nicole, Franzel, and Dani. He seems to target Kaysar right from the get-go, which was really disappointing for me as a massive Kaysar fan. But this does lead to the safety suite, which is the new twist here, where for 3 weeks, the players get to choose which week they want to play. And the winner of this competition gets immunity and gets to save another person for the week as well. And I like this wrinkle to the game. I really like this twist, even though it is easily gamed and it was gamed by week 2. But I wouldn't mind seeing this return. But we did get Kaysar winning the comp, though, he was only competing against Janelle. And really, the comp itself, to me, was really boring. But with Janelle and Kaysar now safe, Cody is forced to target Keesha instead, as he didn't know who she was, and also nominates Kevin as a pawn. But I do feel like these were good nominations for him. And overall, I do feel like Cody played this first week pretty well, and obviously this was a sign for what was to come. We did also start to get some more serious segments within this season as well, with people like Kaysar and Devon having these discussions about social issues, which aren't really commonplace in Big Brother. Obviously with Survivor, we've been having these a lot more recently, but it was interesting to see Big Brother finally do it. It doesn't really fit with the show, in my opinion, but obviously it was really interesting to see. We didn't get the veto competition, which, this is exactly what I'm talking about, where it's like they're rocking on a banana. Come on, but whatever. Enzo wins, finally wins a comp. In BB12, he only won 1 comp the entire season. So to see him win one right off the bat on this season, it really did feel like, is Enzo changing as a player? But then obviously we found out, no, he's the same. But whatever, we eventually get a unanimous Keesha eviction. And let's talk about Keesha, who I did find her pretty disappointing on this season. Obviously, she was an alternate. She was someone that wasn't allowed the pregame or anything because, she had no time to. And through that, really didn't have many connections coming into the house. Though, I don't feel like she really did much. And this is the problem here, is that I don't get how she didn't know she was going home. It's so strange to me that she kept on going around to these people asking if she has their vote. They wouldn't commit to her. And she was like, okay, yeah, okay. It's like, how do you not realize this, that they're voting you out? Really, just overall, I just feel like she didn't make that much of an impact on this season. Obviously, first time around, she was this massive, explosive character. She had, obviously, Keisha's birthday, one of the greatest moments in the history of Big Brother. She is a competent player, but here, I just found her so underwhelming. She didn't really have much to do. And to be honest, there are many times where I just forget she was even on this season. Now for week 2, where Memphis wins HOH, and the show really tries to show the committee alliance here as the alliance that's running the house. Obviously, as Memphis was like the mastermind of this group, the person putting it together. But at this point in the season, this alliance was a joke. None of the alliance trusted Memphis, and they looked at themselves as an alliance without him. The committee wasn't a real thing. Now the committee is going to be looked at as one of the most dominant alliances in Big Brother history, but it was an alliance that wasn't even real for half of its existence. It's so strange to me that that's the case. But even then, it's more so just due to their dominance in challenges, more so than their undying loyalty to each other, as again, many of the members within it didn't really get along. But as I mentioned earlier, Memphis pretty much games the safety suite here already in week 2 by just not telling people his nominations, so that way he can get people to waste their pass so that he would have an easier time winning the comp the very next week. And while this is the most optimal move from a probability standpoint, it did make him come off as a dick. To some other people. And to be fair, now we know at the end of the season that he is a dick. But I do think he played that first week pretty well to where like people really liked Memphis coming into week 2. But really from this point forward, he's kind of going to be known for being this like really domineering personality. And speaking of him being a dick, we do eventually get to the twist on the have-nots here, where again, I really like this twist that they made, where the previous have-nots get to pick their replacements. This adds a new layer of strategy to the game, some possible conflict here, and we instantly see Memphis pick David for being a rookie. And really, the way that he treats David just really doesn't look great. But also, Memphis does come off sketchy to his alliance this week as well, with him like refusing to go after Kaysar and Janelle, despite literally every person in his alliance wanting him to do so. But instead, he decides to go after David and Nicole Anthony instead, which does lead to Tyler's confessional calling Memphis lame, and this obviously led to a whole bunch of memes about Tyler calling old school boring, but Tyler does really fight this week to save David, as, I mean, David was one of his billion final twos, which that's something I didn't even talk about. I really love watching Tyler in the early days of the season, and while he would play so passively about 99% of the time, he would just out of nowhere start playing for like 30 minutes, and through that would come out of it having like multiple final twos. So I found that kind of funny, but the target this week was Nicole Anthony, and this is where we get the uproar over Janelle and Kaysar trying to save her, but her not believing them. And I understand her initial rationale for this, but by the end of the week, it should have been very clear that they were telling her the truth. But really, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter anyway. She ends up going home, despite David campaigning terribly this week. And I mean, to be honest, this was one of the more interesting weeks when it comes to their vote, as there was definitely a possibility that Davon and Bayleigh would have turned on David. I mean, they were definitely considering it at one point, largely due to just how terrible David was playing. I mean, like, he revealed that he's in this guy alliance that doesn't actually exist. Like, he was in a guy's alliance. Like, why would you admit that? Like, it's kind of funny that, like, now, at the end of the season, I do feel like I have a pretty positive opinion of David, especially as a character. But, I mean, looking back at the season, I mean, he really is a terrible player. But whatever, let's talk about Nicole Anthony, who I never thought of as that great of a player anyways. I always looked at her BB21 game as pretty mediocre, and I think she was even worse here. I mean, she was another one of these players where she played too passively at the beginning and wasn't able to build any real bonds with people in the game outside of, like, Kevin. Like, she talks about how she wanted to work with Tyler and was surprised that Tyler didn't approach her, but it's like, then why don't you approach him? Like, he's part of the majority. You're not. Why does he need to approach you? But we also have her like completely misread the dynamics of the house, with her thinking that Janelle and Kaysar were running the house and that they were directly targeting her, when it's like they're on the outs and they're trying to save themselves. But I never had much confidence in Nicole as a player, and I do think this season really confirmed that. Now for week 3, where we get a crapshooty HOH comp and Janelle almost wins, but instead we get a Tyler HOH. And this leads to a pretty slow week in terms of the main events, where Janelle and Kaysar are the targets here. And once they lose veto, Janelle clearly is going home. But there were some interesting events here and there. I mean, during the have not pick, we do get Nicole picking Janelle and calling her out while doing so. And that was a pretty bad look for her, in my opinion. But it was a pretty fun moment for the show. The safety suite was pretty pointless this week, as the majority alliance were the only ones playing. But it was during this week that Tyler really upped his game, where it becomes clear that he sees the game for what it is. He sees that Cody, Nicole, and Dani are the core of his side of the house. So he decides to branch out to Bayleigh and Davon, and through also having relationships with Christmas and David, it really seems like Tyler was setting himself up to be the leader of the resistance. And I thought it was going to be cool to see Tyler face some adversity, which is something he didn't really face that much of in BB20, especially after those first initial weeks. But then we get David blowing it all up by revealing to Davon that Cody and Tyler told him about Davon thinking about taking him out last week. And this is obviously terrible from David, but I do find it impressive how Tyler was able to handle this. Like, he rebounded from this pretty quickly and was able to put all the blame onto David, while being able to reaffirm his allegiances with Davon and Bayleigh. Now, obviously, these don't last, but I do think this is one of the highlights of Tyler's game here. And as I said, I mean, Janelle ends up going home, and we do get some hinky votes from Dani and Enzo. And I love how, like, Julie is such a terrible host here again, where she, like, acts so surprised when Dani throws her vote on Kaysar. It's like, oh my god, is Janelle staying? But it's like, Dani's been wanting to do this for days. Like, she's been on the live feeds talking about how she wants to throw a hinky vote. It's like, and we have that, and then also her like really propping up Memphis as like the dominant figure in the game, like talking about how the committee is this major alliance and everything. It really just made her come off as aloof, though again, it pretty much just feels like they willed the committee into existence, but whatever. Let's talk about Janelle, who was more of the same on this season as she was on BB14. I mean, she came into the season with a massive target on her back, and to be honest, I don't think she's a good enough player to ever overcome that. While she did enter in a bad position, she did have opportunities to better her position. I mean, we'll talk about it again with Kaysar, but I do think her biggest misstep in the game was not aligning with Tyler earlier on. And Tyler wanted to work with them at the beginning of the season, but they completely neglected that relationship. And the same goes with Cody. I mean, Cody wanted to get rid of Kaysar over Janelle, but she started openly targeting him as well. And she also isolated people like Kevin and David by openly campaigning against them. So, I mean, yeah, she had a massive target on her back coming into the season, but she also played very poorly as well. Though, obviously, it was fun to see her back on the season, and it was really nostalgic to see her and Kaysar back together here. Now for week 4, where once again, we get so close to a really interesting HOH where Kaysar blows everyone away in the first round, only to lose against Enzo. And that really sucked. Enzo was one of Kaysar's worst case scenarios coming into this week, where very few people were actually actively targeting Kaysar this week, as many of them would have gone for either David, Davon, or Dani. But with Enzo winning HOH, he was pretty much well positioned with everyone in the house but Kaysar. So I do think this was a massive stroke of bad luck for both Kaysar and the viewers. But during this week, we did get some fun moments, like Dani lying about her hinky vote to Cody, even though she literally told Cody that she wanted to throw a hinky vote the previous day. And this was a major sign to me that Dani just thinks she's a much better player than what she really is. But this is another week where the gameplay of the week itself was pretty dull, where Enzo obviously puts up Kaysar, and with Christmas as the replacement nom after Kevin wins the veto, he pretty much seals Kaysar's fate right there. But this was probably one of the better weeks, though, in terms of the strategizing for the future. I mean, we saw this proxy war between Cody and Tyler where they were fighting for control of the game here, where Tyler was able to fully flip Davon and Bayleigh against Dani, and was even able to get Enzo on board as well. And through that, I mean, Cody really sees his position crumbling here, and this is really the only adversity Cody faces throughout the season, really, as he was in just such a dominant position the rest of the season. But here, he is starting to lose control, and we do see him go to Enzo, and this is where he tells him about the committee, and through that, he's able to reel him back in a bit. But really, he's not able to fully fix the damage that Tyler has done to his game, and it's really through really strange circumstances that we'll obviously talk about the next week that Cody is able to go back into a dominant position once again. We do get a decent amount of Ian content this week, as Ian was the possible replacement nom before Christmas decided to volunteer, but we also get this mastermind edit from Ian where he starts talking about how Cody and Nicole are the core of the house and they're like an octopus, and the show really plays this up as like, oh my god, he's a genius, he figured out the game. But there's a couple things here. First off, there was obviously the wall yeller. I mean, if you're part of the online community, you obviously know about the wall yeller or wall yellers, but whatever. There was multiple occasions of a wall yeller that was able to spread information to the game. This first one here did yell that Cody and Nicole are running the game, and even then, first up, this information wasn't correct. I mean, obviously we do see how the season plays out, but at this point in the season, Cody and Nicole were not running the house. Cody and Enzo were the core of the house. They were the ones running the game. I mean, Cody and Nicole, yeah, they were working together, but they weren't really the dominant force within the season. But whatever, I mean, Kaysar does end up going home here, largely due to his own actions, and it was just really frustrating to watch this week with him, where Tyler really flipped Enzo on Dani, to where I do think there was a possibility that Enzo could have backdoored Dani this week. But I do feel like Kaysar really forced their hand, to where at this point, Kaysar keeps on telling people that he's going after Cody and Tyler. And through this, it just makes no sense for them to not get rid of Kaysar here, because Kaysar's coming after them. So I did find that disappointing, but Kaysar does leave with a really great speech on his way out where he calls out the highest dynamics, and while he wasn't entirely correct, I did think this was a pretty fun way to say goodbye to him on the show. But let's talk about Kaysar, who, I obviously was really excited to see him back. He's my favorite player from when I was a kid, and it was really surreal to see him back on Big Brother. But, again, he didn't play well. I really thought he was going to come into this season as a different person. It had been 14 years since he last played, and his life is obviously radically different from where he was during BB 6 and 7. But he came in and played the exact same way. And yes, there wasn't much of a chance for him to do well on this season. He wasn't put into a good position right off the bat. Obviously Cody was targeting him right away, but the way he handled the game after that first week was also very poor. Now again, part of it is him getting unlucky with competitions. If him and Janelle had been able to win those comps that they came very, very close to winning, the game would have played out differently. But even then, I think it really just buys them a week or two. It doesn't really change the overall game dynamics. And while I always looked at Kaysar as someone who I always thought if he had returned at some point, he had a great run in him, I think at this point, it's pretty safe to say that, sadly, Kaysar just isn't that good of a player. Now for week 5, which was a week that I found just straight up not fun to watch. While the gameplay of the previous weeks had been pretty stagnant, I really enjoyed watching the positioning from both Cody and Tyler, but this week just kind of blew all of that up and also brings in some nasty drama as well. But let's start by talking about the HOH, which was the knockout comp, and this was really fun. This was really great. We saw Cody and Dani taking shots at Devon, and Devon winning round after round after round. But once again, we get really unlucky with the HOH comps. Probably the most unlucky result of the season, where Christmas ends up beating Devon in the final round without having ever answered a question. And I love how Christmas lets us go to her head, where she really brags about her winning HOH when it's like, you did nothing to do it. Now, I haven't really talked about this in the previous weeks, but throughout the previous weeks, there had been some drama between Dani and Nicole and Bayleigh and Devon, especially because Devon was playing really sketchy, where she would try to test players with information for no real reason. But through that, Dani and Nicole had been poisoning Christmas against Bayleigh and Devon to get them on the block if she had ever won, and obviously now she wins. And Christmas keeps on using this justification of Bayleigh told me that they were untouchables, but it's come on, that there's other people having relationships in this game. It's mostly because at that point Christmas wasn't really aligned with Bayleigh and Devon, and that's the reason why she does end up putting them up. But this is also the week where we get the BB basement, which I never loved the black box comp, as I just think it's really uninteresting to see these players walk around in the dark and you can barely tell what's even happening most of the time. But whatever, we had 3 powers up for grabs, and it was nice to see David finally get some redemption here. Obviously, he went home in the black box comp last season. This time, he's the first one to finish, gets a power, the most powerful of the 3 powers, and he's the only one that eventually ends up using it successfully anyway. Christmas ends up winning one, but she never ends up using it, and then Dani's just sucked, where it allowed her to get an HOH to play in the HOH comp again, which is so useless. But this is the week that we do see Tyler's game finally blow up. But unlike the previous instances of this in the season where Tyler quickly recovers from it, this time he doesn't. And all this stems from Dani and Devon and Bayleigh comparing notes. And really, Dani is lying through her teeth during these conversations. Dani 100% was coming after Devon and Bayleigh, and the info that Tyler was giving them was correct. They end up believing each other's lies and pin everything on Tyler. And we do see Dani go up to Christmas and even try to get Tyler backdoored, which obviously doesn't happen because at this point Tyler was Christmas's #1 ally. But eventually we do get Christmas winning the veto, which was ironically the running comp that she won in BB19, but this time she actually had to do it. But this is where we get to the major storyline here, and probably the biggest game changer of the season, where Tyler decides that he wants to quit. All season long, he had clearly not been into it as much as he had been in BB20. Obviously, BB20, he was able to play masterfully for those first few weeks, and then pretty much dominate the game from that point forward. And on this season, he played so passively in that first week, and while he did make some final 2 deals here and there, he really didn't even become included within the majority alliance until the last few days of that week. And since then had just been riding with that majority alliance, but you can clearly tell he wasn't having the fun that he had last time. He wasn't enjoying playing the game. He wasn't really playing the game nearly as hard, and when he was playing the game hard, it was either to correct mistakes that other people had made or to target Dani. But here we do see him go up to Bayleigh and Devon, where he reveals that he wants to quit the game, and he talks about wanting them to stay in the game because they're playing for something bigger. And obviously, him wanting to quit the game itself is terrible, but I do feel like this statement in particular is what really bothered me here. It just felt completely unnecessary to bring this very real life situation into the game. I mean, I do feel like him making himself look like this martyr for this cause was just not the way to approach this. I mean, especially because it's so clear that the reason he really wants to quit is because he wants to be with Angela and doesn't want to be on the jury. So for me, this is just an icky situation that does sour me on the season as a whole, especially because this became a pretty major part of the season. If this didn't happen on the season, I do think the season plays out very differently, where Tyler probably has a lot more control coming into the end game. And I think there would have been an actual war between Cody and Tyler, but instead we just eventually see Tyler just fade away. But through this situation also, we do get the fight between Christmas and Bayleigh and Devon. And again, this was another just really icky situation. I mean, I actually do agree with Christmas's sentiment of the ridiculousness of this like personal game information. It's a really arbitrary concept. But obviously, I don't like how Christmas was acting through this fight, where she was acting like she was the victim in all of this. And really, this was just, again, a terrible look for Christmas. But when we get down to the vote, I mean, there were people like Cody and Enzo that actually did prefer Bayleigh staying, but really they didn't care enough to save her. So because Devon had more locked numbers, Bayleigh does end up going home here. And Bayleigh was someone that I thought had a lot of potential coming into this season. I do think she actually played pretty well for her first few weeks. But I do think what really brought her down was her relationship with Devon. Both the fact that they were an obvious pair to the rest of the house, but also because Devon kept on blowing up their game with her really misguided approach of testing people that led to people distrusting her. And with Devon in trouble, that essentially leads to Bayleigh being in trouble. And I do also think that her legacy from her first season, being this bitter juror that cost Tyler to win, I do think that also led to her downfall as well. We do also have her rocky relationship with Tyler on this season that didn't help either. So I do think there were many things going against her, though I don't think she played her last few weeks in the house particularly well either. I mean, despite being very well positioned early on when she did align with like Cody and Enzo, I do think Bayleigh has a massive flaw in her game both times now, and that is that she's unable to separate game from personal. I mean, I think that's largely what that personal game information talk was, where she's not able to understand that just because you have a personal relationship with someone doesn't mean that it translates to a game relationship, especially when she does nothing to actually build a game relationship with people. But overall, I do still think Bayleigh has incredible social ability for the game, but probably just needs to build on her strategic acumen to really play a great game. Now for week 6, which is probably one of the better weeks of the game, largely due to the abundance of weird scenarios that really end up screwing with things. But we start off with the wall HOH comp, and the show really sets it up as a battle between Dani and Tyler, and Dani plans on throwing it after Tyler fails, but she fails to throw it, and Dani ends up winning HOH. I really thought Tyler was done for this week. And while he wasn't nommed initially, I really thought he was going to be the backdoor target, but right off the bat, she does put up David and Kevin to appease her alliance. But once David uses the disruptor power, Dani kind of freaks out and does end up putting Tyler on the block, which in my opinion was 100% the wrong choice. I mean, especially because she couldn't get him out. I mean, if Tyler's on the block against Kevin, Tyler 100% stays in that situation. So the only reason to get him out was to end up putting him against one of your alliance members in like a Cody, Enzo, Nicole, maybe a Memphis. But she ends up being convinced by Cody to save Tyler anyway. So really for me, this is completely the wrong move, especially because she does eventually tell like Christmas that she's going to use Christmas as a pawn, which ends up ruining her relationship with Christmas as well. Like, I really think Dani just plays this HOH really terribly, even though she was very unlucky in the situations that she had to deal with. But I can't move on from talking about the disruptor power without talking about David here. And again, David's just such a fantastic character on this season, with him deciding to lie about him using the power here. And it's just hilarious to see him go around to everybody asking them, wait, did you save me? I mean, it's so ridiculous. And it made for an incredible montage on the show, especially with him asking like Tyler and Kevin and Davon, who would have obviously used the power for themselves if they were in this situation. But we get to the veto comp, which despite the really dumb intro and special effects, I thought this comp was really fun. I mean, I did like how it tested a whole new set of skills for Big Brother comp, where they had to use these tweezers to stack like 15 small beer cans. And this is really the first interesting comp result where we do get Davon winning her first comp ever in 3 seasons. And this was the first time all season, and really the only time all season, that something doesn't go the way of the majority alliance. And it becomes pretty clear that Davon is eventually going to use the veto to save Kevin. And this forces Dani to choose a replacement nominee, but also essentially makes her have to decide whether or not she wants to take Tyler out. She does eventually get convinced to put Ian on the block so that they can vote out Ian, which I think is obviously a terrible move for her. Ian was more in her and Nicole's corner than any other person within the game. So I do think by her putting up Ian, it's getting rid of an ally for her. Not a great move on her end, especially because she's keeping Tyler in the game, someone that's directly coming after her. But with Ian going home, this also leads to Nicole wanting to save face with Ian, but then she realizes that she can't and has to vote him out. So she goes far out of her way to make her look good to the public by trying to, at every opportunity, to talk to the camera about how it just kills her to think about being in the house without him. And it's really just funny. But the plan eventually balloons into this blame David for Nicole's vote plan, where Nicole wants to make the vote split 5-3 with Davon, Kevin, and David voting out Tyler, so that she can pretend that David is the one that flipped on the plan. And it does happen. I mean, it does actually happen somehow. And we do get the first real blind side of the season where Ian gets voted out. And I felt for Ian. I mean, you can clearly tell the disappointment on his face when he heard the vote result. But he did exit graciously, despite spending the entire week being pissed off and talking about how he's going to be really bitter if he is a juror and how he's probably not even going to want to go to the jury house. But obviously that doesn't end up mattering. But let's talk about Ian on this season. Again, I feel like he played pretty poorly. I mean, Ian is another one that I was really excited to see back because I was expecting him to radically change the way he played the game. I mean, he's matured over the last 8 years since he played, but really ends up, again, playing the same way. I mean, he mistakenly thinks he's part of the majority group for most of the game. Again, 4 Prime is very similar to the Quack Pack, where he unknowingly joins an already formed alliance, but without his ability and challenges to back him up, plus also him somehow getting even less loyalty from the fake alliance that he formed, he never really had a chance here. I will say, though, that I do actually find it kind of impressive how, despite having this massive target on his back for being a former winner, that he was able to even make it this far. I mean, obviously we've seen Nicole make it much further, but Ian was never part of the majority group. So for him to make it to jury, I still think it's a pretty decent result for him. And really, I mean, he gets taken out due to a lot of strange circumstances. I mean, he had the disruptor power, take a person off the block, but then also had to have a person off the block in Davon use the veto to put him up. So essentially he was like, what, the 4th or 5th option there, but really gets taken out just due to a myriad of twists. That being said, though, I do feel like he was too complacent with his positioning, and really the only time he had any real agency in the game was when the wall yeller gave him the information, and even then he didn't even use the information properly. So I mean, I do really feel for Ian. I feel like Ian really wanted to prove himself on this season as a player, after obviously his legacy being that of him winning due to a bitter jury. But sadly, I don't feel like he was successful in that. Now for week 7, which was a pretty slow week gameplay-wise, with Memphis winning HOH and him not telling people what he was going to do. And again, there was also some ugliness this week as well with Davon and David, with Davon believing Nicole over David about hit the vote, and with her like just berating him and him getting really pissed off, which again, this is David, the most frustratingly calm person in the house. So I really don't get how Davon doesn't instantly start to believe him at the point that he does this, especially because Nicole does a pretty poor job at lying about it too. And we can fast forward a bit here, but it's not until the wall yeller explicitly yells to Davon about Nicole's vote that Davon finally catches on to what really happened there. And again, I just feel like this is another example of her terrible read on the house. That again, like before the season, she was known for her really strong reads. this season she was just completely off, and this was a major example of that. I also don't love how like Devon keeps on talking about how she was like looking out for David the entire game. It's like you were considering voting him out week 2 and then was like actively targeting him for the next few weeks. I mean, it wasn't until the Dani and Tyler situation happened that you get flipped on Dani, but it's like you were going after David at a point. I mean, this is just ridiculous, but whatever. I mean, on the edited show, Dani actually gets a lot of credit for this situation, which I found strange. I mean, it's probably because, like, obviously Nicole's not willing to admit to her villainy here while Dani is, so Dani does scoop up all the credit here, but we do get some drama this week from the Have Not pick where Devon picks Christmas and Christmas gets irrationally upset, so that's something. We do also see Memphis and David make a deal where Memphis won't put him up as long as David will throw the veto, and this does partially play out where Memphis does put up Devon and Kevin, but it turns out Memphis's real plan the entire time is to backdoor David. For some reason. Again, why? Why are you backdooring David? Come on. Now, this did bring some level of entertainment here, where like Memphis does tell his alliance after the veto pick that he wants them to throw the veto so he can put up David, when like no one wants this. Like he's literally the only person that wants this to happen. And it was really frustrating to see like both Devon and Kevin get house guest choice, and they end up picking Dani and Nicole over David when David would have used the veto on one of them. But we eventually do get Tyler winning the veto, and it was pretty fun to see Memphis being really grumpy that no one did what he wanted them to do, but he eventually comes around to not using the veto, and Tyler gets a lot of credit for this on the show, where like Tyler's shown like convincing him to do so, when in reality it was really a team effort of Cody, Enzo, and Christmas along with him convincing him not to do it, and that it was better to get rid of Devon this week to weaken Dani. We did also get Zingbot this week, and I mean, Zingbot sucks now, so I mean, there's not really much to talk about that. But this week we did also get the creation of the Wise Guys, which was Memphis's plan for the end game, where he does build a real Final 2 with Enzo, but then also makes 2 different sets of Final 3s, adding in Cody and Christmas, and calling all these alliances the Wise Guys. And I thought this was pretty fun. I really loved this segment, where like, even on the live feeds, I mean, this was all in one shot, where like, Memphis, Enzo, and Cody make this deal. They kick out Cody. Christmas comes in. They make the deal with her. They kick her out. And then like Memphis at the end of all this like looks at the camera and says, that was too easy. Again, this was really fun. I really enjoyed this. But when it comes down to the vote, again, there wasn't much movement there. Devon does end up going home with Dani and Nicole both voting for Kevin for jury management sakes, I guess. I don't know. Well, let's talk about Devon here. I mean, I thought coming into the season, Devon was the best position player based on who was on this cast. I mean, based on her reputation preseason, I do think she should have had an easy ride here, but she ended up playing this season really terribly. I mean, she had this obsession with knowing like every little thing going on in the house, when you're never going to know every little thing going on in the house. I mean, you're just wasting your time and losing time to build bonds with other players. And through her testing other people's relationships, that makes her come off as really sketchy, which was the start of her being targeted by Dani, which caused this massive spiral that leads to the Tyler situation. She also had terrible reads on the house this season, despite her spending most of the time trying to get information to make good reads on the house. I mean, her handling of David was just terrible, where, yes, David sucks, and whenever he's telling the truth, it comes off as like him lying to people, but it was just a bad read for her to trust pretty much everybody else other than David, when David was one of the few people that were actually truthful to her. Again, she's still a great character. She's an all-time great character. One of the best characters in the history of the show, a master of the DR, but just a really bad player. Now for week 8, which was a pretty boring week, once again, due to a really boring HOH result. Again, Cody wins HOH. So obviously he's going to keep the status quo, but we did get the neighbor twist this week, which was pointless. I mean, it was bad. It just felt like a way to add Dr. Will to the show for no real reason. I mean, like, he very clearly just showed up to film this segment like for like 30 minutes and then left immediately afterwards. I mean, really just had 2 clips that were shown. It was pretty dumb. But this did introduce some prizes to both the HOH and veto comps, and this did add a fun twist to the standard hit your ball into a hole comp that we get for HOH, even though it did lead to a pretty boring outcome. We did get this ridiculous segment of both Nicole and Dani lying to each other about their hinky votes from the previous round, so that was something. Dani used her rewind power, which was pointless and actually really harmed her in the game. Like, it's kind of funny how, like, she was using this on Memphis to build a bond with Memphis, but actually ends up with, like, no one involved in this situation being happy with how it played out. Cody does the obvious and nominates Kevin and David, and Cody and Kevin get into a really awkward fight in the HOH room, but it was fun to watch Cody get infuriated, which doesn't happen much on this season. We had Enzo reveal the wise guys to Cody, which I found really fun as well. I mean, Cody did also consider going for Christmas this week, but that really leads to nothing here. We got Otev for the veto, which was so weird. I mean, this psychedelic salamander being the host of the HOH comp. Like, why wasn't it Dr. Will? I mean, Dr. Will was supposed to be the neighbor, and it's even weirder because, like, they create this backstory of, like, the salamander throwing a party at Will's house. It's like, what? Why is this a thing? But there was a $10,000 prize up for grabs in this comp, and I did find it funny how, like, David got it in the first round. And this does piss off pretty much the entire house. I mean, pretty much everyone but, like, a Nicole and Tyler, I think, was pretty irritated at this, but obviously I don't fault David for doing so, as at this point he was probably pretty safe. It was also fun to see Nicole struggle to climb the rope, but outside of that, I mean, this was a pretty boring comp. Cody wins, doesn't use the veto, Kevin goes home. And let's talk about Kevin, who I loved on BB11, but on this season I just feel like he got a really terrible start. I mean, he got used as a pawn right away, and from there on he really just couldn't recover. I'll be honest, I actually don't look at him as a worse player after this season. I know a lot of people were really upset at his, like, really bad reads at points, but I do feel like at the end of the day, I mean, like, I think he just played a very similar game to how he played last time. It's just that he wasn't able to get any semblance of power within the game, unlike what he was able to do last time. I mean, like, considering he was on the bottom the entire game, he got 9th place. Like, he made it pretty far into the game. It's just that he couldn't execute a big move like he was able to last time with Big Jeff. This time, again, Cody's a much better player than Big Jeff. So, again, there wasn't really much he could do. And it sucked to see him go out here because I do think he was one of the few people that would have actively targeted Cody and really shuck up the game. But he kind of goes out here in a whimper, though. But with Kevin's boot, we do get to the triple eviction, which is a twist that I was always interested in seeing BBUS try out and improve upon the BB Can triple, which just sucks. But I do feel like the US format here is a lot better. I mean, we essentially get 2 doubles in a row. But even then, I feel like at this point, I would rather just see 2 doubles throughout the season than have one massive event in a triple. As I do feel like with this triple, it just sucks all the air out of this season. I mentioned this earlier where I said I feel like there was one particular really bad decision that production made this season. I feel like it's the triple. I feel like through having the triple right now on the season, I think this is a terrible position for the triple, considering this is around the point where the game was starting to get interesting. But with 4 more weeks still left after this triple, it really made the end game of the season a massive slog. And the triple itself doesn't even start off that well, where we get the worst possible HOH result with Memphis winning HOH, and he's pretty much the only person in the house that wouldn't have targeted a committee member. And we had Tyler, Enzo, Christmas, and David wanting to go for Dani. We had Cody, Nicole, and Dani wanting to go for Christmas. But we got a Memphis HOH, so of course he goes for David. And despite David eventually going home, we did get a lot of intrigue on the way there, where we do see Christmas winning the veto. And I did think at the time there was a chance she uses on David, in the hopes of Memphis putting up Dani, but obviously that didn't happen. But instead, she doesn't use it, but this leads to a really interesting vote where Christmas and Tyler try to flip the vote to save David. And I remember just being really ecstatic when we saw Christmas go in, vote out Nicole. Tyler comes in, votes out Nicole, and then Enzo comes in, and we see Tyler talking to him in the hallway and everything. It's like, oh my God, is this going to happen? And then he just walks in and nonchalantly votes out David, and that sucked. But I will say, I do think this is the correct move for it. I know there was a lot of controversy about this move where, like, people were saying, oh, Enzo, he gave the game to Cody. He should have gotten rid of Nicole. It's like, that. I do feel like that was not the correct move. And we will talk about this more so when we talk about Enzo's game at the end. But I think Enzo's greatest flaw was the fact that he couldn't win any competitions in the end game. I do think at this point in the game, it was much better for him to keep his bond with Cody than it was for him to get rid of Nicole, who was someone that wasn't really a threat at this point in the season. But because of all this, David does eventually go home. And let's talk about David, who I have a tough time wrapping my head around. Again, this season, we did see him really played terribly. And I thought last season, at the end of last season, I did say that I thought David had a lot of potential if he were to play again. Again, it seemed like he had pretty accurate reads on the game, despite him having some social faux pas at points, and like him deciding to run for camp counselor, which I thought was a misstep for him, but I never really faulted him too much for those things. But after this season, I think it's pretty clear that those were signs that he's a pretty bad player. I think that's really more of the norm for him than him accurately reading the house. Now, I don't think he's a bad person or dumb in real life or anything. I think he's the opposite of those things. But I think within the game of Big Brother, I just don't feel like he fits in. He's just so socially awkward in most situations, and this awkwardness leads to many people just not trusting him despite him telling the truth to people. Again, Devon doesn't trust him the entire season despite him always telling Devon the truth. I think he also has a faulty strategic mind, as proven by him hiding that he used the power and him blowing up Tyler's spot to Devon earlier in the game. I do think David is a pretty bad player, but he was a really entertaining one. I think he's probably one of the more memorable characters for me on this season. Again, him lying about using the power is one of my favorite moments of the season. So I do love the chaos that his awkwardness brought to the season. Now, before I talk about the final part of the triple eviction, I might as well talk about here how incompetent production was during this episode that led to one of the funniest moments for me in the history of the show, where Julie Chen spends the entire episode saying, you know what, let's keep the triple eviction a secret for a little while longer. Only for production to be so dumb to have the triple eviction banner scrolling behind Julie to where the players can read it right before David and Nicole give their final pleas. Like, it was so funny to me that this is how bad production is, how much they don't think things through. Get to the final 7 round here, which to me proved why I do think we should have gotten a double. As imagine if we got this double where Tyler and Christmas tried to flip on the majority lines, failed to do so, and we get the results that we get here where like we get an entire week of Dani being on the block and really like begging people to keep her in the game. I think that would have been so much fun. It's such a shame that this was fast forwarded. We would have had her getting into arguments with like Tyler and Christmas, her finding out that Cody was going to vote her out. I mean, we would have seen so much more fallout from the David boom. So I do think this was a terrible round, the fast forward, but I did find it funny how like we used the exact same setups for the comps, which I get from a COVID standpoint, obviously, but it did feel really cheap to me. We did get Tyler winning HOH, and this leads to another upset element of the triple here, and that is that Tyler ends up targeting Dani, which he was planning to do all season, but I do find it underwhelming, as I do feel like this was one of the last chances that they would have had to make a move on Cody. As from this point forward, Cody, Nicole, and Enzo win out. I mean, that 3-person core is able to get to the end of the game through solely winning competitions at this point. So I do think this was the last time someone had to put them up. I was even saying this during the actual triple eviction. I really thought Tyler should have put up Cody and Enzo, make sure Cody goes home, and then the game's wide open from that point. Or even then, I think also targeting Memphis would have been a very good thing for his positioning as well. But at the end of the day, he does target Dani, and by getting rid of Dani, he essentially does the dirty work for Cody and doesn't end up bettering his position either. So I don't get why he even cared enough to win the veto, as really him winning the veto here just magnifies the target on his back. But we do eventually get around to a unanimous Dani vote, and we would have fun from her exit where she refuses to hug Tyler and Christmas. But again, the actual boot itself was kind of underwhelming to me, especially because this has been in the making since week 3, week 4 of the game. So it had been a long time coming. Let's talk about Dani, who I was really excited to see return here, as again, I feel like she had a lot of potential on her return, and I do think she showed that right off the bat. During the first week of the game, I do think she was the best positioned in the house, but I think she just naturally started playing way too hard, and I think she does this on any season that she would play. At the first inkling that she could be targeted, she decides to spill her alliances to Janelle. That was obviously pretty bad, and that really just sewed up so much distrust between her and a good chunk of her alliance. But also, just coming into the game, both Cody and Tyler just seemed to distrust her right off the bat, with Cody thinking of targeting her on day 1 and Tyler never clicking with her on a game level, probably due to what Dani has said about him in the past. I'm surprised she lasted as long as she did, though, as again, she had been targeted for a while, and for her to make Final 7 is pretty mind-blowing, but I don't think it's due to anything remarkable that she did. Really, again, I feel like it's just the committee winning out that allowed all those members to reach the end game. Plus, also, I just feel like she was ruining her position as time went on. I mean, she got rid of Ian. She let go of Davon, two people who were very close to her and would have been working with her towards this end game. So while I do think she was a major figure on this season, and I do think as time moves on, she'll probably be looked at more favorably on this season, despite her having some questionable comments and actions throughout the season. I do feel like overall, though, she did play pretty poorly, despite, to be honest, this probably being the best game that she's actually played. Now for week 9, which was another week with the worst possible outcome, Cody wins HOH, which was a really awkward stripping comp that we've seen many times in the past, but usually it's only a one-off, and it's a timed comp with only one round. This time we see it over and over and over again. It just felt really weird, but Cody obviously nominates Christmas and Tyler. His initial target is Christmas, who he has been targeting for a little while now, but Cody also wins the veto. Really, the week comes down to Tyler messing up here. And again, I still think Tyler is a great player. For some reason, I still don't understand. Tyler decides to go to Enzo and reveal to him about the committee. Unbeknownst to him, obviously, that Cody told him about the committee weeks ago to rebuild trust with Enzo after Tyler had made an inroad with him earlier. And during the veto episode this week, Enzo gets this really OTT edit about how he's too good for this game. And I found this to be just such a massive contrast to what we've seen from him previously, but he talks about how he's tricked Christmas and Tyler and he's going to blow up Tyler's game to Cody. And there's a lot of back and forth on who the target is eventually going to be, with obviously Tyler being the more dangerous player. But for Cody personally, I do think there were a lot of benefits to him keeping Tyler, as Christmas was the only connective tissue between Tyler and Memphis. Plus also Christmas was the only person that was directly targeting him. But they do end up landing on taking Tyler out, and it does end up working out for them, especially because of how the comps played out from this point forward. But I do think this might have been a little bit of a misstep for Cody. But again, it does work out for him, so whatever. So let's talk about Tyler. And Tyler's a really tough player to talk about here, where obviously he had just come off of BB20, being one of the most dominant players in the history of the show. But on this season, he clearly just wasn't into it. I mean, he didn't have Angela. He thought he was going to have Casey, but it turned out she wasn't there. I mean, it really just felt like he didn't care about what was going on in the game here. And whenever he was playing the game, he was just running through the motions. But I will admit, I don't actually look at him as less of a player than what he was on his original season. Again, up to week 4, I think he played pretty well. I mean, he started to position himself really well, was able to turn Enzo, Bayleigh, and Davon against Dani, had a really close bond with Christmas, David, and Cody, plus also had the committee alliance, which was, again, a really good position for him in the game. I think the problem is that he tried to quit the game. And through that, he really just sabotages his positioning in the game, where he mismanages some relationships afterwards. He loses the trust of Christmas and loses his grasp on Enzo. David was already partially lost at that point. He really just never manages his relationship with Cody super well. So, I mean, he really loses all semblance of control he had in the game and really just became the biggest foe for Cody in the end game, where Cody was just way better positioned at that point. I still think he is one of the most skilled players to ever play the game, and if he were to fully commit to playing the game, I do think he had a really good shot of winning this season, but I just think he wasn't into it. And I think the fact that he does end up getting 6th place is actually pretty astonishing in its own right. And again, he actively sabotages his own game and still somehow gets the 6th place. I can't believe he got out of the Dani HOH, as that was a spot where he 100% should have been going home. But really, I just don't feel like he had a path in the endgame. I think he really dropped the ball on securing his final 2s, despite making a good chunk of them, and through that, didn't really have a chance here at the end. Now for week 10, which was, oh my god, this is where the season really starts to drag. As I said, we have an entire week for the final 5, final 4, and final 3. It's this is just way too slow. And this is also where it becomes very clear that the show's really struggling for content as well, where we get really drawn out segments where we get some weird character scenes, particularly with Enzo and Cody. On the Thursday episode, we spent half the episode at the jury house. I mean, it really just felt like nothing was going on here, despite there being a little bit of some back and forth on who was going home. But even then, it wasn't particularly interesting, because you could just tell it wasn't going anywhere. But the HOH was pretty riveting, though, as a Christmas HOH would have completely turned the game upside down. I mean, she was the only person actively targeting Cody at this point, and she almost wins the comp, but Nicole wins instead. And again, one of the more boring outcomes, she puts up Christmas in Memphis, and one of them's essentially going home. I mean, Nicole is pretty adamant that She wants Memphis out this week, and though there was some debate from Cody and Enzo on whether or not it was the right choice to keep Memphis, as I do think keeping Memphis was better for their positioning, as again, Memphis legitimately wanted to go to the final 3 with them, but was also worse for their ability to win out. So I could see the debate go either way. But Christmas does get a decent amount of content this week as well, with her like really trying to turn Nicole against Cody, but obviously that doesn't end up working. We did get BB comics for the veto here, and some of the comics this year were really terrible. It really felt like a lot of them were made very, very early on in the season, as most of them had no references to the actual events of the season. I did find it weird how the current players were just like roasting the former players in the DR. But again, this week was just filled with a lot of weird content like that. We also had like Cody roasting Victor during the HOH room reveal. We had like Enzo talking about his foot stalker. We had like Christmas talking to the toy duck. We had Enzo using a teapot for the first time. We had Enzo talking to Mulan before the veto comp. I mean, there's just so many filler segments during this week that obviously normally wouldn't make the cut, but because they had to drag this out, they were actually included. But we eventually get their vote where Memphis is blindsided. Cool, a blindside on this season, I guess. But well, it was pretty dull. I mean, he wasn't that bitter, and he had kind of sensed it coming. But whatever. Let's talk about Memphis, who I understand is hated by a good chunk of the fan base because, I mean, again, he's kind of a dick, but I was actually really intrigued by how Memphis played the game here. I mean, in the modern meta of Big Brother, players are incentivized to play for the group over the individual, especially early on, as we've seen now over and over and over again on recent seasons that a member of the initial majority group ends up winning the game. And that with the exception of Steve, the winner of the most recent seasons are people that remain loyal to a particular ally the entire way. So to see Memphis use this meta in creating the committee alliance, an alliance of all the strongest competitors, to be able to reach the end game while also playing a pretty individualistic game on his own right by making moves that only benefited him. Again, like keeping Janelle and Kaysar was to the detriment of his alliance, but it was better for him personally. Targeting David in triple was something that only him was going to do, but he was able to get him out. Again, like it was pretty interesting for me to watch. I know people don't agree with that, but I do think he brought some entertainment to the season. However, I do think his social game was lacking. But again, the fact that he was able to reach the final 5 with a decent chance of winning games, I think is something that I never would have expected coming into this season. Again, like as a character, while he's not the most riveting character in the world, I think he had some interesting moments, especially like his creation of the Wise Guys I thought was fun. Really, the biggest deterrent from him as a character is the fact that he's kind of a dick. But other than that, I did actually have fun watching Memphis on this season. And now for week 11, the final 4 round, which was so boring. Again, continued off of last week, so many filler segments here. But there was some interesting stuff, I guess. We saw the return of Night Moves, which is one of my all-time favorite comps. Though I do question why we got it at the final 4, as having only 3 people in the comp wasn't the best case scenario. And also this comp is one that really benefits the people playing in the middle, as we saw like Christmas and Cody go after each other, and through that Enzo kind of wins by default. But I did also find how Cody handled this to be pretty interesting, where Cody ends up throwing this HOH, which in turn actually betters his odds of getting into his ideal Final 3. As something I think most people actually forget about the Final 4 HOH is that by winning that, you don't get to vote, meaning that you don't really have influence on the people that you're going into the Final 3 with. So I do think if Cody had won Final 4 HOH, Enzo would have more than likely voted out Nicole. And that would mean that Cody would have been in a must-win position coming into the Final 3. So I do think he takes a risk here by not winning the Final 4 HOH, and through that, essentially has to make sure that Christmas doesn't win veto. Because if Christmas wins veto, he's gone. But if Christmas doesn't win veto, he gets into the Final 3 in a situation where he's against Enzo and Nicole, 2 people that are more than likely going to take him to the end, and both people that he can easily beat, which essentially means he wins the game at the Final 4 if it works out perfectly. And I do think this is a risk that he actively took, and it obviously did work out in his favor. But outside of that, I mean, like on the show itself, this was easily the worst week of the show. I mean, there's so much filler because like nothing was going on. We get these random conversations for no reason. We get this scene where Cody talks about his nose. We get Cody talking about how he hates bananas. We get Cody getting his eyebrows waxed. I mean, a lot of bad Cody content. And worst of all, I mean, we get this ridiculous luxury comp, which for me is the strangest segment in the history of Big Brother. To watch these really terribly animated comic book characters fighting against each other with these predetermined results, and the players like cheering on these characters was just so weird. And we get a lot of Christmas content this week as well, with her being on the outs and crying for most of it. She's upset that Enzo put her on the block. It's like, it doesn't matter. Like, nominations don't matter at Final Four. Like, she was upset that she didn't pick Memphis in the draft and is worried he's going to be upset at her. It's like, he doesn't care. I mean, like, I could tell you that now. Like, he doesn't care. But whatever. I mean, as I said, Cody wins veto. Christmas goes home. Let's talk about Christmas, who obviously wasn't the strongest option coming into this season. Definitely someone that I don't think anyone was like super happy was going to be on the cast. But I do think she actually played okay on this season. I think she was playing actually pretty well for the first few weeks of the game, but I do think her HOH week really spiraled out of control, where she just lost her mind in her arguments with Bayleigh and Devon, and also just worsened her position there. I think she just has a massive lack of self-awareness. But then after that week, I do think she plays okay again. Again, her position was definitely severely damaged, but she still played most of the game without ever being in danger. Mind you, a lot of that had to do with the fact that she probably can't win a jury vote. I really don't see how Christmas wins this season, even if she does get to the end. But she does position herself well. I mean, again, she has good relations with Memphis. She has Tyler. She had Nicole at a point. She had Enzo at a point. I mean, she did a really good job at pulling in David. I do think she did well up until the triple eviction, where, again, at that point, she fails to save David. That ruined her position again. Though, again, at that point, I mean, she was the only person willing to go after Cody, and she was really the only hope left for the season to have some level of intrigue. But then she doesn't win a comp for 3 weeks in a row and ends up getting taken out eventually. So, whatever. I mean, character-wise, she was pretty much the same as last time. I do think she improved her gameplay here. But again, her massive lack of self-awareness is probably the biggest thing that harms her chances of ever winning a game of Big Brother. And now for the final week of the game, the final 3 round, and like most of the season, not much actually happens here. But unlike other seasons of the show, we got 2 episodes before the finale. We did get the standard recap episode, which, I mean, this might be pathetic, but I actually thought this was a better episode than most of the other episodes in the end game of this season. And we do follow that up with a Monday episode that was really pointless. I mean, they spent a lot of it recapping the Final Three's games. We get a segment of a Zoom call with the pre-jurors, and that was weird. And then we get to part 1 of the final HOH, where Nicole ends up winning part 1, which I was actually really surprised by. I really was expecting Cody to win that. But that does lead to part 2, where Enzo has no shot against Cody. And we see that where Cody gets a time of 4 minutes, and Enzo gets 37. I did think this was an interesting comp. I mean, it was something that we hadn't really seen before. I did like the aftermath of the comp as well, where we see Enzo lash out when he recognizes that he's probably going to lose, and he's in the exact same situation that he was in BB12. But also at the same time, again, I really feel bad for him. Again, like, for him to play again, work so hard to get to where he was, and again, be in a position where he's probably getting 3rd again. Or at least that's what was in his mind at the time. I really feel for him. I mean, he obviously had missteps along the way that caused him to get into that position. But really, I feel like the main nail in the coffin for him is the fact that he can't win these endgame comps. And if he had, I do think he would have had a much better shot of winning the game. But we get to the final HOH, which was really slow. I mean, especially because Cody gets a 1-point lead very early on, and that makes the rest of the comp really boring, where Cody finally wins final HOH, and we get to the moment that everyone was waiting for at this point. Who is Cody going to pick? I know a lot of people thought Cody was going to take Nicole, which, I mean, I was personally never in that camp. I always pretty much thought he was going to take Enzo, because I always felt like Nicole's argument of being a former winner was just too large to really allow that to get to the end of the game, while Enzo really had nothing against Cody. And I was right. He votes out Nicole. But this was probably the most riveting part of the end game stretch here, possibly of the entire season. This return from the commercial break, where we see like Cody crying and Nicole crying, and I think at that point it was pretty clear to me that like Cody must have told Nicole she was going home. But then we see him like look her right in the eye, cut her right when she's like sobbing and begging to stay. It was really riveting TV for me. But now let's talk about Nicole as a player, and I know a lot of people don't like her, but I've always been a proponent of her BB18 game, not that she played perfectly on that season by any means, as I do think she got very lucky towards the end of the game, but I always thought of her as a pretty good Big Brother player, if not borderline great, and I think she really proved that this season. I think she really solidified my opinion that I already had on her game. Again, to see her be a former winner and still get to the end again against a field this tough. I mean, this was, again, people complain about, oh, this was an all-star season, but this was a very strong field here. And we had so many people on the season that had gotten like second and third place. Like so many people that had gotten to the end of the game had previously gotten to the end of the game. And for Nicole to still be able to get to the final three in that situation, I do still think is impressive. But I do think this season really exemplified her biggest flaw in the game. And that is the fact that she's too loyal to her number one ally. I mean, back in BB18... she was the same way. She was too loyal to Corey. She was willing to go to the end of Corey in a situation where Corey probably beats her at the end. And she gets saved from that by Corey being sniped out at the final four. But this time she wasn't as lucky, with Cody completely dominating the game the entire season, never really having the opportunity to be sniped. And I really feel like Nicole was the exact same player and character on this season as she was in BB18. And while it does come with that fatal flaw, I do think for the most part that is a good thing, as she once again proved that she is a great player. Not a flawless one, but one that can play the game relatively consistently. But after this, we get to this standard jury questioning with the same format we've had for the last few years, and I was really disappointed by that. I really thought with this 2-hour finale here, I thought we were going to go back to longer questioning, but they don't. I know a lot of people were mocking Enzo's performance. I thought he had a really fun energy to him. I mean, I think the problem is that he was kind of scattered. I don't think he really was planning on being in the final two. I think he really thought he wasn't going to make it there. So because that, it was pretty clear that he didn't really have a full-form speech in his head. And really, he had no real counters to things that Cody already had done better than him. Though I will say, I don't know if Cody gave the best performance in the world. I do think Cody was a bit cagey with some of his answers, where I do think he still talked in this way that he was essentially blaming the people that he took out for them being taken out. Like where he mentions this idea of him keeping around people based on their loyalty to him, which I do think was a bit of a snipe against Memphis and Tyler. But overall, though, I mean, his performance was still pretty solid. I do think Enzo's final speech was really fun, where you could just tell how happy he was that he didn't get third again. And he spends like half the speech actually just propping up Cody before saying that he was using him as a weapon. And really immediately afterwards, we get Cody just countering pretty much everything Enzo just said. Him talking about how he wasn't nominated the entire season, about how he got all of his alliances to the end. And I think when we saw the players put the keys in the box, it was so clear there that Cody had won the game. We get a really boring reunion afterwards. I found that really slow, but we get to the votes, and unsurprisingly, Cody wins the game, which was a long time coming at this point. And even more impressively, he ends up winning unanimously. But before the episode ended, we did also get America's Favorite House Guest, which I was pretty happy it did go to Davon. As one, I mean, it seemed like she genuinely was so happy that she got it. It was a pretty heartwarming reaction to see there. And while I do think Davon played terribly, I do think she is a great person and someone that I was happy was finally rewarded for her being such a great character on the show for the last few seasons she's been on. But now let's move on to the actual final two, starting off with the runner-up in Enzo, who really surprised me this season. I was expecting him to go early. I really didn't think his BB12 game was repeatable, but he really proved this time that it was. I mean, he pretty much played the exact same game as last time, but on a greater scale with much tougher competition. And somehow he went the entire season without ever being targeted, which is really impressive. However, I think his biggest issues are that he couldn't win comps in the end game to better his positioning and his reputation with the jury. I mean, the jury loved him. The problem was that they didn't respect him, largely because he didn't show to them that he really did anything. And even the points that he had to make to the jury were points that Cody had as well, and Cody did even better than him. But the other issue is that while he did build really strong social bonds that caused people to not target him, he never utilized those bonds in order to make any moves on the season. And instead, like when he's perfectly positioned within the Wise Guys, we see him go and blow up his position by telling Cody about it. And I think that very much makes him look like a Cody minion there. And also we have the David move, which I know a lot of people are really upset by. I actually don't hate the move, because the thing is that if he does vote out Nicole at that point, he does piss off Cody, Now, Cody would obviously have less options in the game, but I think that also makes Cody less incentivized to bring him further into the game. And like Enzo would have been in a much worse position moving forward. Again, for me, it really comes down to the end game comps. I mean, at the point of the Final Four, he still had a win scenario, a very blatant win scenario in getting to the end of Christmas. He just didn't win the right comps. And to be honest, even if he did, I don't know if he would have made the move he needed to make to take out Cody. But I do think he blatantly wins against Christmas. And I do think he has a shot to win against Nicole, especially if he cuts Cody at the end. There were scenarios where he does win the game, but I do think his lack of comp wins in the end game really do cost him. I do think Enzo played a much better version of the games played by like a Josh or a Casey. But again, with this all-star jury, he obviously wasn't going to gather enough respect to end up winning the game, especially against someone like a Cody. And now let's talk about Cody. And Cody straight up played the most dominant game in the history of Big Brother. And while I do think there is still a debate of him or Derek as having played the most dominant game, I do think Cody's game was more impressive to me overall. Cody never sat on the block the entire season. He almost broke the record for the most amount of comp wins, despite rarely ever actually needing those comp wins. The only time that he actually needed a comp win was the final veto, and even then, if Enzo or Nicole had won that veto as well, he was safe. He essentially just needed Christmas to not win that comp. He was able to masterfully gather the respect of the jury. He always knew his optimal move at every opportunity and was able to execute it. I do think he is the type of player that actually thought about every single scenario and was able to think about those scenarios accurately due to the amount of information that he was able to gather, due to him having a wider range of allies within the game. The only thing that I can think of that I would personally put his game below Derek for is the fact that he was technically more in danger during the end game than Derek was. This was by design. I mean, Cody kept Christmas in the game for the entire end game because he thought of her as a weaker physical threat, as he was better than her in every possible way in competitions, while people like Tyler and Memphis were bigger jury threats and had more of a chance to win in a competition against him. So, like, I understand why he did it, but that is the only real thing I can really knock against him. Now, he was in danger of being targeted throughout the season, but he was never actually going home. There's no scenario where he goes home unless he's on the block against Enzo, and no one was putting him on the block against Enzo except for maybe Kevin? And even then, I don't think it was a guarantee that that was going to be the case. I mean, Cody stays against Dani, stays against Nicole, stays against Memphis, stays against Tyler, stays against Christmas, stays against literally everybody but Enzo. And that is an impressive stat as well. He really had no trouble throughout the entire game outside of week 4, where we do see Enzo starting to lean a bit towards Tyler, and we do have this kind of pseudo war over Enzo's loyalty, but Cody is able to get Enzo back in his favor, and he was out in front, being perceived as the leader of his majority alliance for almost the entirety of the game, and was still never targeted. Now, obviously, I do think luck came into play at certain sections of the game, but that's the case with every winner. Obviously, he got lucky that the committee won as many competitions as he did, but I do think probably the biggest piece of luck for him is the fact that Tyler tried to quit the game, and I do think through that, he pretty much had no opposition anymore after that point. But for me, it's really insane how dominant of a game Cody was able to play here. Now, where does he rank as a player? I mean, he's definitely up there. I do plan on updating my top 10 player of all time list sometime down the road, so I guess stay tuned for that. But he's definitely going to be up there. In terms of winner rankings, I mean, he's number one. Straight up. I mean, like, I cannot see how, using my criteria, he would not be number one on that list. And he's played a game that I've been waiting for someone to play on Big Brother. I mean, he's in the upper echelon for me of the most impressive winning games in the history of reality television. And before this, I had Derek and Dane listed as truly dominant winners of the game of Big Brother. But for me, Cody is on a tier above them. I mean, he's the closest reality TV winner we've ever had to Kim Spradlin in my mind. I mean, Kim Spradlin from Survivor One World played the most dominant game ever, in my opinion. Like, a game where she wins against pretty much anybody in the game and was positioned to pretty much get to the end of the game by the time of the final 7. And while Cody's not as dominant as that, I think he's the closest we've gotten to that in a while. Again, I mean, by the time of the final 4 veto, he had 100% won the game, which, again, the game of Big Brother is much harder to control than the game of Survivor. The game of Survivor is a very linear game. If you're able to hold the majority of the numbers within Survivor, you essentially win out, with the exception of idols and whatever. But Big Brother is very contingent on competition wins, and through that, it's a lot more difficult to control. but Cody was able to do it. And I just find that so impressive. There's really no major flaw for me to knock against him, unlike every other winner in the history of Big Brother. Now, I know some people would bring up the pre-gaming stuff, and I might talk about this even more in a future video, but I really don't factor that against Cody here, as, again, everybody had the opportunity to pregame. I'm sorry Cody did it better than the other players. I mean, I really don't think pregaming actually had that much of an impact on this season, like many other people think it did. I mean, we saw the creation of the committee on the feeds and how they decided on the members of it. We did see the bond between Cody and Dani be very rocky on that first day, and how they were able to bond from that point forward, which, again, some people claim was a pregame relationship. I mean, same goes for Cody and Nicole, where, yeah, they had a final 2 from very early on, but it was very clear that she was never his real number 1, and that he wasn't really telling her information until around the midpoint in the game. I really don't look at the pregame as having that much of a factor on this season, especially not being the deciding factor on who did well and who didn't, especially when we had someone like an Enzo get second place and he didn't pregame at all. And really, if there was blame to place, I would place it more so on the people that didn't pregame or pregame poorly, because that caused the relationships that were formed through the actual pregaming to really prosper here. As, again, like, for me, it's like, if you're going into an all-star season, you should expect there to be pregaming. That is part of the game of an all-star season. I mean, every all-star season in the history of social strategy games have had pre-gaming involved. So by not pre-gaming, you are missing out on a fundamental part of the all-star game. But whatever, I might talk about that more in a future video. Who knows? But for now, I mean, that's pretty much what I gotta say about this season. Let's talk about the final assessment here. I mean, this season wasn't great. I mean, as of right now, I'm literally recording this like immediately after the finale. I do think this is easily a bottom tier season of the show. I think there's a serious debate for this being the worst season of the show. I mean, when I look at my season rankings, right now I have BB2 at the very bottom. I'm obviously outside of BB1, but that's not really even included. But I mean, BB2 for me, like, I don't love BB2 as a television product because I think there's a lot of filler on that season. I think it's very slow paced. And to be honest, despite this being a modern season, this season had that too. I mean, the endgame stretch of the season was terrible. There's no real intrigue beyond the triple eviction. And while the first half of the season was fine, there were still some icky moments within that. And the gameplay was pretty stagnant at points, and I really just don't feel like this would be a fun season to rewatch. I mean, obviously my opinions might change over time, but as of right now, I do think this is a bottom 2 season. I personally enjoyed seasons like BB16, BB19 much more in this season. While all 3 of these seasons have been completely dominated by a single player, at least those seasons had people that made it interesting. Again, like, I think 16 had a great cast overall, but even then, like, I think Derek dominating the game was relatively fun to watch, and I thought Paul running the game was fun to watch for me personally. Here, watching Cody dominate the game is just so boring, and it's like, he's not a fun character by any means. Like, he's just a very bland personality, and because of that, it does make this season harder to watch. So for me, I found this season to be relatively bad overall, and definitely extremely disappointing. With that said, I mean, that's pretty much the video. Hopefully the next video I do will be the player ranking. That is the plan. I will be ranking every player from this season based on how they played on this season, so stay tuned for that. As I mentioned earlier, I would also like to redo my top 10 players of all time video. Hopefully that'll be coming sometime within November. But for now, though, that's the video. That's my review of Big Brother 22. Thank you for watching.